This morning, Father Peter Damian Fehlner is continuing with that paper that you received yesterday. The notes were pages 1 to 28, Scotus and Newman in Dialogue. He's going to refer to that, but he's going to begin by picking up on the question that was raised towards the very end by Professor Noone in his paper.
Very good. I'll begin by saying I'm in complete agreement with the observation at the end. If you attempt to establish a profound continuity, similarity between the thought patterns of Scotus and Newman, but you admit that there is an exact identity between two sets, intuitive and abstractive, as Scotus uses it, and real and notional, at least terminologically speaking, as Newman uses it, you won't find any. You find, as it were, the differences are greater than the similarities. But what the question that needs to be raised, and this will explain what I am doing in this, what might seem like long-winded and excessively complex presentation, that's not the starting point for establishing the point, the resemblance, the profound resemblances with Scotus and Newman. What needs to be said, very simply, that passage at the beginning of the Grammar of Assent has always been the stumbling block, the rock of scandal since 1870. Effectively, the rest of the grammar has been read in an interpretation, nominalistic, or if you wish, agnostic on the part of Newman. I don't think that is the case. But if you simply stay at that particular level, you will have to admit that the criticisms that you have just heard are perfectly legitimate, which will help to understand why I have begun the considerations not from the grammar of assent, but rather from a consideration of Newman's views in theology, particularly Christology and Mariology, because in fact this is where we will find the most striking resemblances between the thought patterns of Scotus and Newman. For Scotus, that involves, of course, the use of univocity of being in place of the theory of divine illumination and the particular form of Christian exemplarism favored by Saint Bonaventure, which is often, therefore there are no thought patterns of profound likeness between Scotus and Bonaventure. I don't think that is true. Because if on the one hand, Scotus does not want to speak of a difference between image and vestige in creatures, and therefore seemingly holds with St. Thomas that there are only two forms of divine concursus, namely the general or the natural, and the specific, which is of the supernatural or supernatural order, or you run into a problem. But Scotus, as it were, seems to deny that there are creatures which are naturally prope deum and prope nihil, according to Bonaventure, the Brave Ockham, the whole second chapter, then all of a sudden he introduces a metaphysical term, perfectio simplicite simplex, which says that those creatures which are endowed with simply simple perfections are in fact nearer God, because other creatures who are not angels and men don't have them. It is a radical difference greater than the resemblances between man and the beast. And nowhere is that more apparent, and it also is met in the considerations of Newman, with a number of passages that I've deduced, and also from the grammar, that between knowledge as a simple perfection or good, end in itself is the term of Newman, but it corresponds pretty closely to the idea that stands behind the perfectio simpliciter simplex. You find out that what he seems to call real apprehension, closely related to sense perception, is not the whole story. Obviously, therefore, the terms that Newman uses are in need of a certain, if my approach is correct, are in need of a certain correction and deepening through the study of the metaphysics of Scotus, which seemingly are implicit in so many places in the writings of Newman. One of the interesting points is the final edition of the Oxford University Sermons came out in 1871, 1 year after the grammar. As you read the critical evaluation of the relationships between faith and reason, faith and holiness, his understanding of what is the equivalent of the affectio justitiae and affectio commodi of Scotus, give us some idea of the fuller background that needs to be supplied for a correct interpretation. You have two false interpretations of Newman, based ultimately on this passage. Weatherby and most of the other traditionalists will say, you see, Newman can't be corrected. He's a danger. And at the opposite extreme, the modernist extreme, represented by Nicholas Lash, he shouldn't be corrected. That's the right position to hold. I think both interpretations are simply wrong-headed. You can read the rest. Now, in the conclusion part, what I've tried to do, therefore, I should say the basic outline of this long presentation, it's the three parts, basically. A simple statement. Are there any authorities, respectable scholarship that holds there could be not simply a superficial but a profound relation, similarity between Scotus and Newman? I gave a few instances of that in those first 3 pages that you have. Secondly, what in the Franciscan, again, is the metaphysics. I think Newman would admit this, that which is beyond the physical, the wisdom, the sapiential needs to be given priority, the two luminous beings. The whole series about the so-called critical question, the relationship between the intellect and the will, the relationship between wisdom and knowledge, that you do not understand knowledge as a pure perfection. If you understand it purely in terms of science, no matter how powerful the argumentation, it merely leads to a conclusion. And I think that on that point, I don't think either Bonaventure or Scotus would disagree with that. But that doesn't mean we're uncertain, that we cannot arrive naturally. Again, the word natural here needs to be taken in the patristic, scholastic sense of natural. Natural refers above all to man. Endowed with those perfectionis, simplices, pure perfection. Natural corresponds to the argument, the anthropological argument, the typology for the proofs, natural knowledge of God in Bonaventure, in the first article of the first question of the disputed questions on the blessed Trinity, is the best that's ever been given. What are called today the physical, those are the cosmological proofs, so-called, of St. Thomas. Bonaventure doesn't, neither does Newman, deny their efficacy, theoretically speaking, and that we must begin with them. We can't start with what is. And that, as it were, the anthropological, and Bonaventure and Newman are extraordinarily close in their discussion of the proof for the existence of God, not from the vestige, but from the image. And only when we have completed those two steps in that order, first the vestige, secondly, we can go on to consider the most powerful and most basic argument of all, sometimes called the ontological. He doesn't get to that argument until he gets to chapter 5 of the Itinerarium, and that is closely related to the point where we begin thinking in reverse fashion. We begin with God, with the name of God, and with the infused faith in particular. We go on to the Trinity, the name of God as one, the name of God as good, and finally, the crowning element, the incarnation, the mystery, in a certain sense, the mystery of mysteries. We have that same integration. We arrive at the sacramentality of creation, which is formed de facto in Scotus without that word, and found with that particular term in all of these things. I try to outline to show where Newman fits into the quadrum, the context of the Franciscan school of theology and philosophy, and also to insist on a certain point. It is true that there is the experiential and the phenomenological, which is given consideration in the trial, but not apart from a sound metaphysics. Above all, a sound dogma. Neither Bonaventure nor Scotus suggest anything to the contrary, but they do insist on the primacy of charity, which means we have to be careful and follow the typology of positions on that question, which is given by none other than Blessed John Duns Scotus. The outline that I have here, you will find, as it were, is there. There. Then, as the final point I want to make is the importance, and I'll read this concluding from the bottom of page 17. And Scotus the metaphysician is, in fact, also not as by profession, but in fact, as Hurlis points out in many Boulois and many others, he's a good phenomenologist, and fundamentally, all of the phenomenological considerations of Blessed John Henry Newman need to be interpreted correctly and sometimes corrected in the context of that sound patristic scholastic tradition, not the tradition that begins with William of Ockham. That is the view I am presenting here. Now, on page 17 at the bottom, this is the concluding part of what I said last night, and it serves as an introduction to the third part of my obit, but not only by a consideration of the theoretical questions involved, but by a consideration of the development of doctrine, you might say, in the life of Newman himself. We see more and more evidence of what is essentially to be found in the Franciscan school, beginning with that famous statement, his conviction, his certainty about those two luminous beings, myself and my Creator, which are not at all luminous in the views of Immanuel Kant. They are the two famous lumina. You can't prove anything. You cannot demonstrate, you cannot derive any certainty, speculatively speaking or contemplatively speaking, in the scholastic and patristic sense, about oneself, one's own ego. You're conscious of various acts, but that's one of the great problems with the interpretation of Immanuel Kant, by saying the reason that Newman had no attraction to him. And secondly, my Creator. If there's, they are simply facts which are impervious to understanding. Whereas in the Franciscan school and in Newman, they're not simple facts. They are the great mysteries, the great truths that before which we are, as it were, totally unconditionally obedient and docile. Kant, in his theory, excludes the possibility of being docile and being a person. Now, what most people fail to grasp in Scotus, as they do in truly great metaphysicians, is that genuine metaphysics is not primarily another science, even if our metaphysics is always embedded in a scientific form. Play on words, metaphysica or supernature. That is a relative, I would call a relative supernatural, not that associated with grace, which makes salvation possible, salvific acts, meritorious acts, but that which grace in the strict sense, presupposes. You can't, as it were, give the gift of grace to a cow or a chicken or a monkey. Simply, no matter how clever they may be, you will never get anything more than a grunt. Something more or less resembling what in us might have some intelligent meaning, but bears none whatsoever. The animals, the trees, they can only give formal glory to God if we give formal glory. This is what St. Paul means. This is the whole of creation is groaning until, in fact, we become holy, and then happy. But the beginning of wisdom, without which no science worthy of the name is possible or can realize those ends for which the Creator designed it, is that use of our minds to contemplate the mystery of being in an enigma, even before we come to contemplate distinctly the reality of infinite being, who is the one God who made heaven and earth, so that we may love that one being who is who he is, and tells us that that being, whose name is I am, is charity. That is the full revelation, the supernatural revelation. There is then for Newman a certain asymmetry between knowledge as such and instances of knowledge. This is perfectly clear in the idea for a university. It may not always be clear in the grammar of assent because he's dealing with a different theme there. As such, and instances of knowledge, such as human knowledge in logical, discursive, or scientific form, Newman points out, especially at the natural level. Assent and inference on that, but we will not arrive at assent if we insist on being illogical. It always accompanies it, but it is the conditio sine qua non, not its goal. What Newman calls the surplusage of assent over inference and other complex processes accompanying assent is a reflection of this asymmetry, which is the very reason Bonaventure says the angels and men by nature are prope deum, not prope nihil. And we'll come to that play I tried the famous phrase of Bonaventure from the 5th chapter of the Interiorization. What is being? Being is in full flight from nothing. A definition or a description which can easily be related to the famous description of ens est cui non repugnat esse. It says where the univocal notion of being. What do the infinite and the finite? Not because there's no analogy, not because they have the same nature. They fall into categories. They have this in common, that they're both in flight from nothing. Secundum quid for the creature, absolutely for the infinite being. To what degree we had the degree that we can be as fully in flight from nothing, especially at the not prope nihil, but prope deum, so close that we can see him as he is and be like him. And anti-metaphysical and anti-dogmatic phenomenology is nothing but a cloak for skepticism. This is the key point I want to stress here in the interpretation of that very ambiguous passage that has led so many astray in the reading of Newman as a modernist, to be rejected or to be applauded. Newman is not a modernist. He is, first of all, a sound metaphysician in the patristic sense of that term, and therefore his basic inclination would be to say, yes, I ought to correct that statement. Otherwise, would there be no point in talking about, as he does talk about, man and the human intellect and the human will as a pure perfection. He doesn't use the term, but that is what he means, and I'm sure he must have come across the term because it comes from St. Anselm, not one invented by Scotus. The certain immutable character of assent cannot be explained in terms of those processes accompanying it and normally required for it in the natural order. It is the same asymmetry met in the univocal concept of being of Scotus and in the so-called fontal object, pivotal object, objectum motivum, objectum fontanum of St. Bonaventure, when he explains, especially in the fourth question of the disputed questions of the knowledge of God. He's discussing the human intellect of Christ, and he makes it clear it's not an excuse for theism. That would be the opposite of what is ascribed by many to Newman, based on that first early text in the grammar. Though only in a shadowy way for Scotus and Bonaventure, as for Newman, the fact of the asymmetry arises from the presence of God. This is why the proof for God's existence is not the discovery of something that we know, but as it were a clarification of a presence that was always there from the first thought we ever had, but not recognized distinctly. Something of this also is to be found in St. Thomas, and he discusses the proofs for God's existence. They're not to be equated with a kind of demonstration that is engaged, particularly in the empirical sciences. We see Peter coming down the street. I didn't choose it to refer to myself. That's the example that St. Thomas uses. I don't recognize him distinctly for what he is. I don't recognize him as God immediately. But I do have some kind of encounter as the starting point. Whether I pursue the implications of the encounter is another question. It's dealt with by Newman in many places in his discussion of the purpose of university training. There are many passages found there, discussed above all by St. Bonaventure, but in the great problem, critical problem that occurs during the third passage from the third step in the mind's journey to God and the fourth step. That is the crucial, it's the challenge, as it were, to make what we know, theoretically, our own personal. And this is the reason Bonaventure has so many reservations about the theories of Aristotle. Did not deal adequately with the personal aspect of knowledge, no matter how necessary the conclusions might be. Though not only in a shadowy way for Scotus, I'm repeating myself. For all three, the beginning of philosophy is already in some way the conclusion at which we aim to arrive, and the process of demonstration required to know God naturally is suspended, as it were, between starting and concluding points radically the same. This process ends exactly where revealed theology begins, according to Bonaventure. Further, this asymmetry explains why intellectual certainty is anchored exactly where St. Bonaventure tells us it is, with the source of that fontal illumination and exemplarity without which knowledge is impossible. And with that incomparable concept of being as univocal in Scotus, with that simplicity and absolute character of assent as distinct from influence. Science in its complexity is by itself subject to change. Wisdom is eternal, or it is not wisdom, the origin and goal of all science. With this, Bonaventure doesn't mean that if we don't engage in metaphysics, we won't arrive at certainty, but it's also important to be able to explain that in order to go on to a deeper and profounder faith. That is the presupposition. The faith that is purely the gift of God, God is a faith that is not mechanical. This is one of the reasons the Franciscans never accepted potency, act, matter, and form as the basic way of dealing with metaphysics, and that ultimately stands behind the discussions of university. In this sense, Newman shows himself a great metaphysician who clearly does have an appreciation of scholastic theology and metaphysics, although he never formally studied scholasticism as a young man. But he shows himself also a great metaphysician, one who can see beyond the merely physical and appreciate metaphysical asymmetry, basis of that surplusage of evidence perceived by the illative sense, that is, a great Christian mystic, even at the level of metaphysics as distinct from theology and mystical contemplation. This is what at root he means by the great dogmatic principle, respect for and acceptance of the authority of truth at whatever level and mode this is made known to us, reason, faith, vision of God. And that is particularly the key to understanding the value of the argument from conscience. The authority of conscience is ultimately the authority of God, and it does not demand a proof in the scientific sense of the term, but only, as it were, a clarification, which is another kind of proving, if you will, but it is not identical with what is characteristic of the methodologies used in the sciences and of Aristotelian as well as modern. This is what at root he means by, in discussing certitude in the grammar of assent, we meet this profound metaphysical insight so redolent of the tradition of Anselm, Bonaventure, and Scotus. I'll give you the quote in a moment, but we don't meet it in such wise that we can simply say everything is proven. You could reduce this paper to a half a page by a comparison or a contrast between abstractive, intuitive, notional, and real. Here is the passage, I am what I am, or I am nothing. Being in flight from nothing, Bonaventure Teteran. Ens est cui non oppugnat esse Scotus. I cannot think, reflect, or judge about my being without starting from the very point which I am at concluding, namely God. But only vaguely, ex umbras et imaginibus in veritatem, we proceed by steps. There is a natural wisdom, metaphysics, but it is not saving. It will not, as Newman points out, for the very identical reasons. I don't know if he copied from the Colationis and Hexameron, the fifth collation. Where metaphysics can tell us so much about virtue, one thing is missing. How do you become holy? You must go on. You need another kind of knowledge, and you also need a gift of grace, as it were, to proceed any further. Nonetheless, there is a continuity. It's not that blind leap that has been so characteristic of Western thought since the late Renaissance and the Reformation. Partly a fruit of Ockham, partly a fruit of Luther, and ultimately canonized by Immanuel Kant. This must be kept in mind in order to grasp correctly what Newman means in the Apologia when he tells us that he believes in the church because he believes in God. He believes in God because he believes in himself. You could read that, as it were, in a Kantian way. But I don't think that would be completely contradict everything that Newman says elsewhere. Implied here, as we shall see in the more detail in parts 2 and 3, those are the examples, I'm not go through them this morning, is Bonaventure's concept of divine primacy. That's in question 8. Disputed questions on the Blessed Trinity is most important, where Bonaventure talks about primacy in God, kind that is associated with the divine persons. Father has the primacy. Associated with the essence of God, the one essence, they all enjoy the primacy. You have one step further than to discussing the absolute primacy of the word in canon. This Bonaventure's concept of divine further developed by Scotus and its bearing on divine illumination and the mind as a perfectio simpliciter simplex and the response to that illumination in personal form. You can't proceed in this matter simply by comparing terms, their absence, their presence, etc. You must look a little bit deeper to see the contours of their thought in the total vision of theology and thought. That is, the philosophia Christiana, the plena resolutio or reductio, can only be made under the light of faith, and ultimately, as it were, will be always conditioned by the degree of holiness which one has attained. Such a concept of philosophy as inherently Christian and contemplative mystical is very much akin to the adage of Tertullian, anima naturaliter Christiana, to which a Bernard or a Bonaventure might add, anima naturaliter Christiana et contemplativa. And of course, it means agreeing with Bonaventure that philosophy, namely love of wisdom, attempted apart from Christ, is doomed to incompletion. Obviously, the acceptance or rejection of this point will have a considerable bearing on how one goes about integrating love of learning and desire for God, as does Newman in his idea of a university, or simply denying that there exists a link between these two. I go on further. If you read the Collationes in Hexameron of St. Bonaventure, and the present Holy Father is an expert on that, you will find in the fifth collation, or conference, a very interesting reflection on knowledge, scientia, in the generic sense, as Scotus also uses it. And then he said, what do we mean by wisdom? That is knowledge as it passes into affection. We see that perfectly. The intellect and the will of God are really identical. His knowledge, now we present it to the object of the will, is really identical, but they are formally distinct. We don't want to confuse them as distinct perfections, simple perfections. And it goes on to say, what is art? Art is nothing more than knowledge insofar as it passes into the effect of a deliberate, willed operation. And he goes, understanding is knowledge as it passes into the choice of wisdom, to link knowledge. And prudence is nothing more than knowledge insofar as it passes into the choice by which we elect to do this and not that. But whatever God does, whether it's this or that amongst the contingent possibilities, which are infinite, all the absolute, it's always ordered. Why? Because his will is always ordered. Because his will is reasonable. It can't be other than reasonable because it's identified with his wisdom. Now then, just to go through this last section, I've divided into several parts. The metaphysical dogmatic trend during the course of Newman's life. This helps to illustrate the interpretation I am placing on various aspects of his thought, which seem to me to be very fundamental. The first point is the two luminously self-evident beings. It's true that the conversion occurred in Calvinistic context, evangelical context, but that soon after Newman became more and more disillusioned with that. He came under the influence of Whately and the Noetics. He tended to go to the opposite extreme, liberalism in dogma, which he tells us in the Biglietto address he had always opposed. It's one of those things, gaining one's balance. But he never, as it were, gave up his resting in the thought of two and two only absolute, luminously self-evident beings, myself and my Creator. This is a passage that occurs early on in the Apologia pro Vita Sua. He does not mean here what in Catholic circles has come to be associated with ontologism or an immediate vision of the divine essence dispensing with the need of any proof of God's existence. St. Bonaventure was misunderstood in the 19th century at Louvain in this sense about the so-called ontologists. Were I to suggest a Catholic term to indicate what is involved, we're talking about the contuition of Bonaventure, in speculo, that was equivalent to a vision of God. No, it was a reflection, but it was a knowledge different from the merely discursive knowledge of God per speculo. He more or less explains that clearly without quite those terms in his introductory chapter. Were I to suggest a Catholic term to indicate what is involved, it would be that St. Bonaventure, contuition, and discussed by Scotus under the heading of direct intellectual intuitive cognition, neither of which terms, strictly speaking, occur any place in Newman. And yet what Bonaventure and Scotus are talking about does occur there, and that is the value of all those texts that I pointed out. Therefore, make more and more this stumbling block text at the beginning of the grammar something that is ectopic, is something that is out of place and needs, as it were, either removal or correction of some kind. By this, the seraphic doctor means the contemporaneous knowledge of God, not by way of a demonstration from effect to cause, discursive, but through another, above all discursive, but in those effects as in a mirror, in speculo, and not by way of a clear objective representation, but in a vague, shadowy, enigmatic fashion, such as Newman suggests in the epitaph for his tomb, ex umbris et in imaginibus in veritatem. But it does explain the difference between knowledge as purely scientific and the same contemplation, speculative area, knowledge as primarily contemplative, which it is always in God. That said, Berry's comment on this is correct in the article in the Old Catholic Encyclopedia. In other words, personality became the primal truth in his philosophy, not matter, law, reason, or the experience of the senses. Henceforth, Newman was a Christian mystic, and such he remained. And in that sense, both Bonaventure and Scotus are Christian mystics, notwithstanding the abstruse style of Scotus. Last evening, when I was responding to the various questions about the absence of the term heart in Scotus, I was pointing out that the basis for the understanding, which is every place in Bonaventure, on the heart of Jesus, the heart of Mary, is ultimately rests in the theory of the absolute primacy of the word incarnate, and that our immediate encounter with God, that is a saving encounter, is precisely when our hearts are in converse with the heart of Jesus, and Scotus would add, through the mediation of the mother, because our only access to Jesus is through the maternal mediation of the mother of God, and he only comes to us through her mediation. This comment is amply confirmed in the motto chosen by Newman for his coat of arms as cardinal, cor loquitur, tu salute Scotus in the sense that Scotus calls the person metaphysically considered a solitudo. And existentia incommunicabilis naturae intellectualis. There's a different meaning of existence, not only between Scotus and Thomas, but also between Scotus and Kant. For Kant, existence is purely a fact. You can have all the science you want, but it doesn't tell you about the essence of the thing apart. It's purely conceptual or purely notional in that sense, in the Occamistic sense of the term. Whereas this solitudo is not an absolute autonomy, but it is the most intimate relationship with the one who made me. I am not alone. Two luminous beings, not isolated, not autonomous, but at once unique and relational, capable of loving communion with another, a communion of persons Newman fully realized in the Catholic Church, precisely because by nature intellectual and capable of knowing divine persons, each an incommunicable existence, yet perfectly and totally within the others. Then go on page 21 to introduce his coming under the influence of Whately, a tendency in the opposite direction, but also there were positive, his appreciation, he was overcoming a certain aspect of Calvinism, the overemphasis on the individual, a lack of awareness, a sense of the importance of the church and the mystical body of life. And in this context, and this is where he began to separate himself from the unacceptable aspects of Whately's position, which are clearly very closely related with Kant. Another reason for saying that if you relate Newman too closely to Kant, you don't take account of something very basic in his life. The Kant's influence in his life is represented indirectly by the views of Whately and the Noetics, and those things he dismissed, although he benefited greatly from his study of logic and his cooperating with Whately in the production of a once very famous textbook of logic. It's worth reading and studying. It's not just Whately you're reading somebody who is interpreting logic in a way quite different from Whately's science. As a scientist, but he discovered Butler. And Butler's insistence on what he calls the anthropological or moral conscience, and his insistence on the sacramentality of creation in relationship to Christ, does recall and perpetuate certain basic positions of John Duns Scotus. It brings us, therefore, to the Oxford movement. I mentioned several works, which I think, if you study them carefully, you find many allusions or relations or similarities to Scotus, particularly in the lectures on justification. But they failed. Because they left out of the equation the primacy of Saint Peter, on which Scotus was very strong. This leads, of course, to the development of doctrine. But I want to point out, which is rarely done, that the idea that occurs there is not to be interpreted in relation to Hegel, to Darwin, or anything. It doesn't matter that coincidentally Newman was interested in the theories of Darwin. That's on the margin. It's a blip on the radar that just as Berkeley, he says in the Apologia, has no influence on his forming his ideas concerning the mystical, concerning the contemplative, concerning the sacramentality of creation. It's more important to relate the idea of development to ratio, reasonableness in Bonaventure and the formalitas of Scotus, and you have a better idea of what the Bonaventure. It's not simply the simple development of the seed, the acorn, to the oak tree. You must first, as it were, understand to a certain extent, as does St. Paul, the plan of God. What was in the mind of God? And this is always uppermost, especially if you read the sermons of Cardinal, both his Anglican and his Catholic sermons. All of this, as it were, brings us to the question of the person and the church, the relationship between conscience and authority, but it comes very close to the Bonaventurian explanation, which is also presupposed for an understanding of Scotus, where he tells us that Christus unus omnia magister. Christ acts from without. It is his authority, the authority of reality. He tells us that the faith as an aspect of all-knowing, not fideism. Noum is simply a humble respect for what is true, apart from what it means for me in the first instance. If we consider what is meant by ratio, reasonable comes from that word, rationalis, rationalis, a host of different meanings. If you take any index, for instance, Father Bougerol's Lexicon Bonaventurianum, and look at the heading ratio. It had to be, I don't know, the poor contributor had to reduce his matter to a page or so. All he could do was list the major usages related one to another of this term in Bonaventure. And if you read the Oxford University sermons, you will find the same thing in Newman. Not quite as extensive, but ratio has many, many different meanings. It applies not only to the intellect, but it applies to the activities of the will. It also has its own rationality. My final considerations are the idea of the university, where we come closest, as it were, to a genuine metaphysical explanation of knowledge with terminology that can easily be translated into Scotus and Scotus into Newman. These are the considerations that lead me to say that when we find one good example of a Scotistic contour in Newman, apart from these ambiguous passages, which are not all that many, we can say that there is more a similarity than a dissimilarity, and at a very profound level. Now, I want to simply before we get to the question and answer here, and then the panel discussion this afternoon. Here are my concluding observations after a review, almost 50 pages of examples. The foregoing is more than sufficient to indicate the presence in Newman's writings of considerable similarity with the thought patterns, theological and philosophical, of Blessed John Duns Scotus. Indeed, still more might be adduced, which for time and space limitation could not be treated except by way of brief references. The most obvious of these similarities are the following: the absolute primacy of Christ. No, well, I'm not beginning with an epistemological question or the terminology, adequate or inadequate, of Newman here. My own opinion is that the terminology of Scotus needs to be used as a reference for interpreting and perhaps, as it were, redefining some of the terms used. The more obvious is the mystery of its bearing on the mystery of the Immaculate Conception, the sacramentality of creation, the concept of univocal being, and in particular of a perfectio simpliciter simplex. This is important to appreciate why I don't think that Scotus repudiated the essence of the doctrine of divine illumination, and rather than the Thomistic act potency analysis to explain the correlation of simple and complex in the human intellect and will. The relation of such a perfection to the definition of person and the relevance to the so-called critical question, the correlation between notional real apprehension in Newman and abstractive intuitive cognition in Scotus. I'll insert there for a point that I am in full agreement with Dr. Noone on the problem that is involved, but I have my own ideas on how to go about it. Anyone who wants to disagree can disagree. They're only personal opinions on my part. The correlation, the nexus between inference, assent, and the illative sense in Newman, and the mental activity and the naturale judicatorium in the Franciscan masters, especially Bonaventure. This is far more important than the correlation between abstractive, intuitive, and notional real. But that particular correlation should be studied in the context of the difference and relation between inference and assent, which I believe is to be found also in the Franciscan school, and the difference between mere science and wisdom. The relation between the proof for God's existence from conscience, the itinerarium of St. Bonaventure, and the De Primo Rerum Principio of Scotus, the correlation between the primacy of the will and rationality and order in both Newman and Scotus. This is important because I don't think Scotus can be understood in his famous proof unless there is a reawakened awareness of the importance of the middle step, the three types of proof that St. Bonaventure identifies: They're all important. They all have their role to play. But you can't go from the physical, or what the version that Newman was familiar with, Paley's, to the proof of St. Anselm, unless you pass through what Newman calls the proof from conscience, which is very, very similar to what you find developed in various places in Bonaventure. Holiness as a link between science and wisdom, the latter being the ultimate goal of all intellectual activity. The positions of Newman and Scotus as a happy medium between secular modernism and rigid fideism, but with the advantage of always, as it were, placing before us that challenge to take personal responsibility for our believing. It is so important at the present time that everyone realize, well, of course there's a risk taken in belief, but it's a prudent risk. This is the important point. There's always a risk in living. We have to, as it were, take possession of ourselves and exercise our freedom. That is why it has been given to us. The relationship, the correlation between the primacy of the will and rationality, and the order in both Newman and Scotus. Holiness as a link between science and wisdom. This Bonaventure collation 19 of the collations on the Hexameron, but it is also quite clearly, especially in the Oxford University sermons, the position of Newman. The latter being the ultimate goal of all. The position of Newman-Scotus. So a certain concentration of attention has been indulged around issues involved in the discussion of the critical question and the relation of Scotus and Newman to Kant, not because they are the only points of convergence or the most important ones, but because this is the area central to interest in Scotus and Newman at the moment, both by critics, Westerby, and supporters Lash, who maintain the first anticipates Kant and the latter reflects him in their approach to metaphysics and ethics. I believe that we are justified in affirming not merely a remarkable series of resemblances between the two great Oxford theologians, but a convergence of probabilities indicating genuine unity of approach to and substantially identical conviction concerning the nature of theology and how to conduct it. I think it can be said further that the more metaphysical style of Scotus uncovers the implicit notional foundations, if you wish, of Newman's thought. He calls them principles, where he certainly, in that section of the grammar, certainly takes a distance from the views of Kant, if not by word, certainly by way of the implications. While the more phenomenological style of Newman assists us enormously in grasping the realism and profound spirituality lying behind the superficially dry and abstract presentation of the subtle doctor. In realizing that Scotus is not the granddaddy of Kant, but the progenitor, in a sense, of Newman, and that the tortuous discipline entailed in mastering Scotus will enable us to appreciate even more the joys of wisdom Newman so beautifully describes. Okay.
Thank you, Father Peter. This final page, we jumped to page 86, and that's why you don't have it. But when we return this afternoon for the panel, you will have this page 86, because that summary, one page, for all of us, is something that we have to engage and breathe. We have a beautiful example here of some competing views, some variations on what Professor Noone finished with in his talk and what Father Peter was then arguing. That marvelous competing view is absolutely central to what we're all about. We're not lining everybody up as an assembly line, as Henry Ford did so marvelously a century ago. So that page you will have when we begin this afternoon's panel. However, the beginning of that panel has to be reserved for that question that our philosophy major from St. Louis University, Alec Plato, raised. And Professor Noone is ready to say much more about Hume. So, and then I will say one more time that one general way of looking at this, when you're looking at a building being built, you see the steel girders go up. What we're building here is we're looking at linkages between Ockham's thought, which I think is fairly clear in what we just heard this last 45 minutes, Ockham to Hume to Kant. And then we're drawing a parallel, Bonaventure to Scotus to Newman. Pause now and we'll receive some questions from our audience before we break for lunch that you deserve. We all deserve.
Question about something, and it's perhaps unrelated to the entire scope of this symposium, but I have a couple of colleagues at Loyola Marymount who are specialists in Lonergan, and one of the things they are looking at very carefully is the Newman-Lonergan link. And I noticed you said on one of your pages, unfortunately I can't find it right now, oh yeah, on page 21, you say there in the middle of the second full paragraph, if Newman's thought is congenial to the tradition of Scotus and uncongenial to that of Kant, and all the transcendentalists thereafter, including the Thomistic, that is, Rahner and Lonergan. I'm wondering, and perhaps you have nothing to add on this, I just know that I think, and perhaps it's a testimony to the importance Newman is receiving now from the larger Catholic scholarly audience, that a number of scholars working on later and 20th century systematic theologians like Bernard Lonergan are seeing an affinity. And I think the affinity they see is between this notional assent and real assent, where Lonergan talks about a judgment about knowing. But I'm not a specialist on Lonergan, so I don't want to go any further than that. I'd appreciate anything you might want to say about the Lonergan-Newman disconnect that you see there, if you can. And feel free to tell me this is not an appropriate question.
Sister, that is a most appropriate question. That is most appropriate, and you asked the right person.
I'd simply begin by saying I don't agree with the position taken up by Lonergan and Rahner. Ultimately, Rahner is often associated with Heidegger, to Heidegger with Hegel. There is an association, but I believe the more important point of departure, if you pardon that play on Maréchal's style, want to depart to the metaphysique, that you'll see that there is a considerable, almost an abyss that separates the views of Maréchal from the views of St. Bonaventure and Scotus. The question, of course, here is that Lonergan, for all his interesting reflections, is basically starting from Maréchal's starting point, which is closely related to Kant. Rahner in the same way. Rahner himself has no use for Scotus, although he has wrote some interesting, early in his life, interesting studies of infused contemplation on Bonaventure, but he makes a radical separation between infused contemplation and knowledge. Father Ephraim Longpré, in an article in the Dictionnaire de Spiritualité, 1937, effectively refuted the interpretation. Whether Rahner is right or not is another question about the theory he's proposing, but it is not the theory of St. Bonaventure, and it certainly wouldn't be the theory of Blessed John Duns Scotus. Now, whether you wish to relate Newman basically to the position of the transcendental Thomas will depend in great extent to the degree that you think he's under the influence systematic of Ockham, Hume, Locke, Hume, and possibly Kant, although Newman himself had little interest in the current German philosophy of that time. More than that I cannot say. I don't think that Newman is basically to be related to the position of the present-day transcendental Thomas. Whatever merit they have in other respects, it's a different approach, which starts from the presuppositions of Kant. And in my reading of Newman, I don't say it therefore, it's a total exhaustive reading. I don't find that Newman's approach is that. His approach seems to be, as he states many times in the grammar, factually I wish to describe what knowledge is about. I'm not interested in raising the question whether we have to critically justify the correspondence between our concepts and extra-mental reality. I take it for granted the correspondence is there. This is the reason why I have difficulty taking that first quotation, which seems Ockamistic in many ways, as being the key to the understanding of Newman's position. Just as I do not think that it is right to interpret Scotus in relationship to Ockham primarily, rather than as a continuator of Bonaventure. I know there always was a great dispute on that, but I think still that the testimony of the English friars at the time of the famous trial of Ockham in Avignon is still the most accurate analysis of the history. In those terms, Scotus is, at that point, the last and the most contemporary representative of the ancient tradition of patristic scholastic theology. This is the point of the Franciscan school. You cannot trace the origin of scholastic philosophy to the theories of Aristotle. They're interesting, they are useful. Scotus went the limit to use them. But the real inspiration of scholastic theology and philosophy is to be found in the continuation of the patristic tradition, with those developments that come precisely from the spirituality of Saint Francis, which is not without its own unique intellectual content. And Ockham is the first of the moderns. If you put it into Latin, it almost sounds like they were calling him a modernist. Anyway, there's been always a great dispute over that point, and there are those today who would say, no, Ockham depends on Scotus, when I think that Ockham is a direct contradiction of Scotus on the most basic points, the one brought out by Dr. Noone in particular, the realism of Scotus. That our formation of our concepts is not a purely mechanical operation to be explained in terms of act and potentiality, as it basically is in the Thomistic system, but that it involves, as it were, a continual contemplation. It's our way of, as it were, in a certain sense, begetting the concept, begetting the word, in order that we might communicate the word, commune in charity. And I would also insist, therefore, that what was meant by reasonability, rationabilitas, is to be found not only in the intellect, but also in the will. And when it is not found in the will, when we have a concept of the arbitrary will, we soon lose our reason. Ultimately, we have to have some, even if we're not Christians, we have to have some experience, some sense of faith. Anyway, that's how I see it.
On that, if I may, about the Newman-Lonergan connection. In a short essay that Lonergan wrote just before his death about his own life and work, he actually referenced the fact that he is known to be a proponent of Aquinas, but he actually says, my primary mentor was John Henry Newman. No. And he says, I read his grammar of assent half a dozen times when I was in. I
don't deny
yes.
that.
Yes.
I don't think he put the correct interpretation upon it.
Okay, but I think there's a major link between that.
I read it in a different way and in a different context. I happened to discuss the matter with Lonergan in 1968. Regis College, and he happened to be there. Heiko Obermann was conducting a seminar. I came to learn that Lonergan, like Rahner, although coming from different standpoints, were both anti-Scotus. They may have been, as it were, pro-Bonaventure on certain points, and both of them may have been influenced by Newman, but in a different context, as I'm saying. But there was no question at all in the discussions that went on when Lonergan was present, that Lonergan was definitely opposed to Scotus. He would reread Aquinas with the help of Newman in terms of Marischal. That's what he was doing. He was even criticized by Rahner in a review of theological method. He says it's all very nice, but it's not theology. If I recall the review in German, I can't remember where it was. Those who are favorable to what is called transcendental Thomism, there's a great deal of criticism now emerging, will say they won't agree with my interpretation of Newman. Nor will they accept for the most part, what the positions of Scotus. They say it's simply irrelevant. He's coming from another world that is impenetrable to the average scholar at the present time. So I simply say I beg to disagree. I think in the end, as it were, if you follow Kant too far, you end up nothing is penetrable. Everything is a Newman, a blank, pure fact that is beyond understanding. So what happens, as it were, the concept of the will becomes that of the absolute arbitrary will. It's right because this is my duty.
If I may add to that, kind of a very much a leading question, and I hope it'll prompt more discussion at our panel. But if one, broad generalization, if one takes a look at writings just before the beginning of Vatican II that Karl Rahner and then the young, now our Holy Father, collaborated on, you see how they were collaborating on various views. When the council was over, we know there's a classic divide that starts to develop. And on the one hand, you see it symbolized by the publication Communio, and on the other hand, the publication Continuum. So Rahner tended to be on the Continuum side, and then Joseph Ratzinger, bishop, archbishop, cardinal, now pope, on the other side. I don't think that we can dismiss that too lightly, why that divide took place, because this is where, Father Peter, my own view is, it gets us into the mind and heart of Pope Benedict right now. Something was happening there in the late 60s and the early 70s, and I think that we're starting to see that in newer publications. And if we can get our finger on what that particular problem is, I think then what you have said, your own view, you're not imposing your view on anyone, you're arguing it extremely coherently. And I can recall even just, and I don't want to take a moment here, but I recall from Insight, I'm not a Lonergan expert by long shot, but I recall from Lonergan's Insight somewhere in the number of 365 to 375 or so, there is a section on Scotus that is extraordinarily confusing to me. So I'm going to pass that to you someday, not today, but someday when we're praying out there in La Crosse, to sort out what it is that Lonergan is saying about Scotus, because I too, as a novice here, simply can't go along with what Lonergan is saying, and I come to the conclusion he doesn't understand Scotus properly. So anyway, these are they're loaded issues, and I promise that page 86, which the audience doesn't have, will be in your hands when we begin this afternoon. We have a wonderful lunch coming up now, and at 2 o'clock, after a slight little repose for all of you, rest your minds a bit and bodies too, then we have the shift in gear here. Now we're going to listen to the personal account of Deacon Jack Sullivan, his profound faith, and what happened to him, and why we have a blessed John Henry Newman. See you then.